we are going to start off discussing the UFC settlement, at least pending settlement regarding its two antitrust cases. The first one was filed by a group of fighters led by Kung Lee in 2014, and then a follow-up antitrust lawsuit that was filed by the likes of Cajun Johnson, CB Dollaway, and others. And the first suit covered fighters that had competed in the UFC from December of 2010 until the end of June 2017. The Cajun Johnson lawsuit covered fighters from that period in July 1st of 2017 onward. So I've seen the estimate that this roughly would equate to about 1,200 to 1,400 fighters. And the way this worked is that, I mean, if Wei and I had competed in the UFC, had made it all the way there to the UFC, and we're in this class period, and we didn't even have any contact with any of the representatives here, we are entitled to the payout here. Wei or I would have physically had to withdraw ourselves from this class action suit to not be part of it. And what you had was no fighters opted out of this, including fighters that were going to testify on behalf of the UFC that did not opt out of the suit. So what we have is the announcement that came out through TKO on Wednesday that a tentative settlement has been reached for the figure of $335 million. This still needs to be approved by a judge, and this could take several months. And we don't know how this is going to be dispersed among the fighters in the two separate lawsuits. We also don't know if this is solely financial. Is there any injunctive relief baked into this that would have changes to the UFC contracts? None of that was mentioned. It doesn't mean that there is going to be further, I guess I could call them penalties or at least changes. All we know is the monetary figure. And of course, when you see a figure like this, and for the Kung Lee suit that dates back over 9 years, I've seen estimates like the legal cost could be like 33% of this figure, which is no small amount that the lawyers will be getting from all of this. And then whatever the fighters get. The fighters are going to get something, and it's not going to be an insignificant amount for them. But when you look at this, it seems like the general temperature I could sense was that people were looking at this to be a game changer for not just fighters in the past of being compensated, but for future fighters to be in better areas of protection when it comes to their status as whether they are independent contractors with the UFC, having the ability to have less structured contracts in the sense that the UFC has less of a clamp on your ability to move promotions and just a lot more rights for fighters going forward. There's no evidence of that. Nate Quarry, who was part of the Kung Lee suit, he did put out a statement on Instagram, and he kind of outlined. And first of all, the no one can really talk about this too in depth for the next period of time until this is all finalized. But the most we got here from Nate Quarry was, no, we didn't get everything we wanted. Our goal all along was to change the sport. However, we had quite a few delays and we had to deal with them. And to get injunctive relief, i.e. change the sport, we would have had to refile both lawsuits and combine them, go through discovery all over again, retake depositions, about a 5-year delay, and then hope we get granted class action status again. We'd be looking at another 10 years just to be where we are today with no guarantee of winning any punitive amount of injunctive change. As I said, weighing all the possible outcomes, this seemed the best outcome. We're not high-fiving one another, but we are pleased that a lot of fighters are going to be getting some compensation for being underpaid. Wish we could have done more. Over time, I'll be able to speak more in depth about all of this, but for now, with apologies, this is about it. And so, I mean, I take from that this is probably going to be limited to financial compensation, which again, I'm not going to downplay. And this figure is not, it's not on the high end of what was out there. Like we were talking about the potential of over $1 billion being awarded, which in this kind of a suit could be treble damages, which means those could be tripled. Like we could have been talking multi-billions of dollars that TKO and the UFC could be on the hook for. On the other side of things, they could have gone to trial and risked getting nothing. Like a judge could have ruled in the UFC's favor. So the figure is $335 million, but it would seem overall that this was taken as a positive for the UFC, that $335 million, it sounds like this is all going to be covered by insurance for them. The stock price went up a sizable margin. If you tuned into myself and Brandon Thurston, you will know Vince McMahon had a pretty profitable day on paper as a result of this stock going up as well. So, but that, brings an end, barring any unforeseen ruling by a judge, to these two antitrust cases. And kind of the sport, I think, is, it's a financial, it's a sizable number that the UFC is forking over, but the DNA of the sport does not feel like it is changing. And I think for fighters, it is, I wouldn't say life-changing money that they're going to be receiving out of this, but not insignificant money either.
Is this the end of any follow-up potential suits? Any threat of that for MMA based at the MMA side of things? And obviously the pro wrestling side of things is a different question.
Yeah, they're both interesting cases. So the way the new UFC contracts are written, and I would encourage everyone to check out the interview we did with Eric McGraken, who's an attorney here in Canada. He was on with Brandon and I and has done a lot of great coverage of this story throughout the entire tenure of the case, going back to 2014. But the UFC contracts, they have specific language now when it comes to participating in class action suits and the ability to try and limit these kinds of cases in the future. It doesn't preclude them from entering a antitrust suit in the future, but there are more deterrents now. And I would, just looking at this, I would think that this route is probably not going to be undertaken by any fighters for the foreseeable future. There is always the ability to try and push through the Ali Act, which applies to boxing, but not mixed martial arts. There is always the chance of fighters one day unionizing or forming an association. But I think that is something that is a far cry from where, like I brought this up on the interview with Eric on Wednesday, is the fact that this was a situation where these 12 to 1,400 fighters, they didn't have to do anything. They just had to sit back, and your risk was that maybe you'll get nothing out of this, but you have to put nothing into this. And the upside is maybe I'm going to get a 6-figure check. And everyone knows, you go to your mailbox and you find a check for $18,000, you're very happy that something like that would happen. And it's going to be way, way more than $18,000. I'm just taking that figure off the top of my head. But for something like an association, that is where you literally need fighters to step up and join something. And we saw with Leslie Smith's Project Spearhead, I mean, it just did not have the support of the significant amount of fighters. And I will always go back to different points in time where the fighters had the most leverage. And I think one of the key times, and this goes doubly so for pro wrestlers, was at the start of the pandemic. And these promotions were in fear of losing out on these television rights deals as the pandemic shut things down. They needed to produce this programming, and they were at the mercy to have wrestlers and fighters that were going to be able to populate these cards. And if you had a sizable portion and of the main fighters that were all going to bandy together, that was a time. That was a time that they could have made a significant argument of, hey, we are risking, we don't go back to April of 2020. We don't know what risks we are putting ourselves at. We don't know what the long-term effects of contracting COVID are and what the CDC is advising us. And we are going to go, and we're like one of the only sports that is going to be going live. Why were they so able to present cards from the UFC and WWE? You didn't have a union in the middle of things to be pulling back or to withhold services during this time period. But I mean, they went through, and the UFC soared during the pandemic, and these companies didn't lose a penny of their television rights deals during that period. And it's just something that is foreign to, I think, the idea of kind of a group collective coming together for something like that could make meaningful changes. And I'll believe it when I see it. I would love to see it happen, but I just do not have faith that we are going to see on either side of pro wrestling or MMA that kind of formation of an association.